Classified evidence log. Case file 74-010. Status: closed. Victims: 10 confirmed. Primary evidence: crime scene behavior, letters, digital metadata. Behavioral pattern: control, sexual sadism, recognition seeking. Investigators note: sometimes the loudest evidence isn't left at the crime scene. Most serial killers are caught because investigators find the clues they never meant to leave behind. Dennis Rader was different. He kept sending investigators clues they never asked for. Not all at once, but through a series of decisions he simply couldn't stop making. Each one revealed a little more about the man behind BTK, until one mistake brought one of America's longest-running serial murder investigations to an end. I'm Detective Cipher from the Classified Mind, and today we're investigating the most disturbing case of all: the human mind itself. Tonight's question is simple. Why would a serial killer who had successfully escaped justice suddenly risk everything just to be heard? Let's open the case file. Evidence marker number 1, the killer who created himself. On January 15th, 1974, police entered the home of the Otero family in Wichita, Kansas. 4 members of the family had been murdered. The victims had been bound before they were killed, and investigators immediately recognized that this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. The offender had planned the crime, brought the necessary tools, and remained inside the home far longer than someone acting in panic. Months later, a local newspaper received a letter. The writer described details that had never been released publicly, confirming he was the killer. Then he did something investigators had never seen before. He named himself. BTK: bind, torture, kill. The letter could have ended there. Instead, the newspaper made a decision that changed the investigation forever. They published it. Overnight, BTK became more than an anonymous killer. He became a public identity. That wasn't just a nickname, it was behavioral evidence, because from that moment forward, Dennis Rader wasn't simply trying to avoid capture. He had something else to protect. The identity he had just introduced to the world. Most offenders try to separate themselves from their crimes. Dennis Rader built an identity around his. Behavioral psychologists have long observed that some offenders create a criminal persona that becomes psychologically rewarding. Instead of seeing themselves as ordinary people who commit murder, they begin seeing themselves as a character, someone powerful, feared, and unforgettable. For Dennis Rader, BTK wasn't simply a nickname. It became the identity that gave him power, purpose, and recognition. The evidence marker number 2, control, was the motive. As more crime scenes were analyzed, investigators noticed the same pattern. Victims were carefully selected. They were restrained. The offender maintained control long before the murders occurred. Years later, Rader admitted he had spent years developing violent fantasies involving stalking, restraint, and domination before ever acting on them. That distinction matters. Fantasy alone doesn't create a serial killer. Most people who experience disturbing thoughts never act on them, but in sexually sadistic offenders, fantasy can become a rehearsal. The scenarios are repeated, refined, and emotionally reinforced until reality becomes a way of acting out the script that's already been written in the offender's mind. Suddenly, the bindings meant something different. They weren't simply a way to control the victims. They were part of the psychological reward. Investigators realized they weren't searching for someone motivated primarily by anger or revenge. They were hunting someone whose crimes were driven by domination itself. Let's take a case break. I need some coffee. You know, every detective has one case that keeps following him home. For me, it's this one. I don't think Dennis Rader's greatest addiction was murder. I think it was becoming BTK. So let me ask you, if no one had ever published his letters, would Dennis Rader have continued killing? Or would being forgotten have been punishment enough? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying today's investigation, subscribe and ring the evidence bell. Every new subscriber helps us open another case file and continue exploring the psychology behind history's most disturbing crimes. Alright, break's over. Let's get back to the evidence. Evidence marker number 3, Why murder wasn't enough? By the late 1970s, BTK had already proven he could kill without being identified. He could have disappeared. Instead, he began writing to newspapers and police. At first, investigators viewed the letters as taunts. Eventually, they realized the communications were telling them something about the offender himself. Every letter forced police to respond. Every newspaper article reminded the public that BTK still existed. From a behavioral perspective, the murders established control over the victims. The letters extended that control to the investigation. This pattern is consistent with offenders who display grandiose traits and an intense need for recognition. Public attention becomes psychologically rewarding, reinforcing the identity they built around their crimes. Dennis Rader wasn't simply avoiding capture anymore. He was protecting the persona he had created. And when the attention faded, so did BTK. Evidence marker number 4, the man nobody suspected. Then something unusual happened. BTK disappeared. The murder stopped. The letter stopped. For years, investigators had no idea whether the killer had died, moved away, or simply chosen to stop. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader was building a life that looked completely ordinary. He was a husband, a father, active in his church, and worked as a compliance officer, enforcing local ordinances. To the people around him, there was nothing that suggested they were living next door to one of America's most notorious serial killers. This is one of the reasons BTK remains so fascinating to criminal profilers. Rader wasn't living a lie every moment of his life. Instead, he demonstrated remarkable compartmentalization, the ability to mentally separate conflicting parts of his identity. The caring father and the serial killer weren't constantly competing with one another in his mind. They existed in separate compartments. That ability allowed him to function normally for decades without attracting suspicion. But compartmentalization has a weakness. The hidden identity still needs reinforcement. Without it, the fantasy begins to lose its power. For Dennis Rader, that reinforcement came from recognition. Evidence marker number 5, the ego that solved the case. In 2004, a newspaper published a story asking what had happened to BTK. Had he died, left Wichita, or simply vanished? Most people would have been relieved to be forgotten. Dennis Rader wasn't. Within months, BTK was writing again. Letters, packages, photographs, messages proving the killer was still alive. Investigators noticed something important. The communications weren't necessary. If his only goal had been to avoid prison, silence was the safest strategy. Instead, he willingly restarted the investigation. Behaviorally, that's significant. Recognition had become part of the reward. Then came the mistake that ended everything. Rader asked investigators whether a floppy disk could be traced. Police falsely assured him it could not. Believing he still controlled the game, he mailed the disk. Forensic analysts recovered deleted metadata linking it to Christ Lutheran Church and a user named Dennis. Investigators quietly focused on Dennis Rader and later confirmed his identity through DNA. For decades, BTK believed he was smarter than the people chasing him. That belief wasn't confidence, it was grandiosity. And grandiosity often leads offenders to overestimate their ability to manipulate others. The floppy disk didn't expose Dennis Rader. His own ego did. Behavioral profile. Let's put the evidence together. The crime scenes revealed planning rather than impulsive violence. The bindings revealed that domination itself had become psychologically rewarding. The letters revealed an offender who needed recognition almost as much as control. His ordinary public life demonstrated extraordinary compartmentalization. And the floppy disk revealed what investigators had been chasing all along. Not just a killer, but a personality. Behavioral evidence suggests Dennis Rader's crimes were driven by 3 dominant themes: sexual sadism, an overwhelming need for control, and a deep desire to preserve the identity he had created as BTK. The murders built that identity, public attention sustained it, and the fear of being forgotten ultimately destroyed it. Dennis Rader believes BTK will be remembered forever. In a way, he was right, but not for the reason he imagined. Today, BTK isn't remembered because he controlled the investigation. He's remembered because his own behavior revealed the mind investigators had been searching for all along. Sometimes the most important evidence isn't hidden in fingerprints or DNA. Sometimes it's hidden in the choices an offender makes long after the crime is over. Those choices tell us who they are. And eventually, they tell investigators where to look. Until next time, keep your eyes on the evidence and your mind on the motive. Detective Cipher, signing off.